Hello, 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 and welcome to this talk and workshop on the subject of the Titanic. You may be studying Titanic already at school. You may have read my book, Survivor Titanic. It doesn't matter if you haven't, but this is a book which I wrote a couple of years ago. It's historical fiction, which means, well, it's what it sounds like, really. It's part history and part fiction. The historical backdrop is completely real, you know, the layout of the ship, some of the main characters on the ship, the timeline of the sinking, but the main characters, in this case, a 12-year-old boy called Jimmy, and another 12-year-old boy, a Lebanese boy called Omar, and a very posh girl called Beryl, those are not real characters. They are just kind of based on the kinds of passengers that would have been on the Titanic. We know that there were lots of children in each of the three classes on the Titanic. What we're going to do over the course of the next hour is I'm going to give you a little talk. I'm going to tell you about some of the inspirations for my book and how I went about researching it and how I went about writing it. And then for the second part, the second half hour, it's your turn to do some work, and you are going to be creating your own passengers on the Titanic. You can imagine them exactly how you want, and I want you to plunge your, maybe plunge isn't the right word considering what we're talking about. I want you to put your character in the middle of an exciting adventure story set during the sinking of the Titanic. So, first off, I should tell you my name. My name is Stephen Davies. I'm a children's author. I write books for young people of all ages, from kind of 3 years old picture books to young adult books for teenagers. And I'd say most of my books are adventure stories of one sort or another. So this book, Survivor Titanic, really fits into that category, survival and adventure story. How the book came about is a bit strange, actually, because usually a writer will write a book, or at least plan out a book, and then go to a publisher and kind of beg them to to publish it. And in this case, something a bit different happened. In this case, Scholastic, the educational publisher, came to me and said, "We're planning a book set on the Titanic for schools. Would you like to write it?" And it was the first time that had ever happened to me, so immediately I said yes. I really didn't have to think about it very hard. I had always been interested in the Titanic as a piece of history and as a story, and off we went. The only guidance that they gave me was that the hero needed to be a 12-year-old boy and that it needed to be exciting. So I envisaged lots of chapters, most of which would end on some sort of cliffhanger, and I started to plan the characters, but most of all, during the first month of working on the book, I was doing research. Research is ever so important whenever you're writing anything even slightly related to history. So I did a month of research and then a month of writing. 2 months in total to complete the project. Now, when it comes to research for historical fiction, there are different kinds of sources that you can look at, and usually historians call these primary sources and secondary sources. Now, a primary source is something that's as close as possible to the time of the actual event. So in the case of the Titanic, survivor accounts are absolutely the most important thing. The most reliable information, of course, comes from people who actually witnessed the events in question. So I read lots of survivor accounts of what happened on that fateful night, the 14th of April, 1912. And I looked at lots of photos. I'm going to show you some of those soon. And I also studied in great detail the layout of the ship. Now, there's an absolutely amazing website called Encyclopedia Titanica, which contains, amongst a wealth of other information, actual deck plans of the Titanic. As you know, there were 8 different decks on the Titanic, and on this website you can download a detailed map of every single deck, from the boat deck right at the top to right at the bottom where the engines, the boilers were. Okay, so this is just one of the decks on the Titanic. This is D deck. So counting from the top, it goes A, B, C, D, and so on. This is the bow of the ship here, the front of the ship. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see all of the different areas here. Look, this is the third class open space where all the wild parties happened in the evenings in third class. And then a wall and some of the first class cabins. This is the grand staircase, which I'm sure you recognize. Very distinctive curved banisters, an absolutely beautiful staircase. And then further along you can see the gaps here, the gaps where the funnels went up through the ship, from the boilers right at the bottom of the Titanic all the way to the funnels where the steam came out at the top. And alongside the boiler casings you can see these areas here. These are called fiddlies, and these came in very handy during the writing of Survivor Titanic, because my characters were able to climb up and down these fiddlies as a way of accessing different decks that they maybe weren't supposed to. First and second class galley, that's the kitchen of course. Second class pantry, second class dining salon. All of the chases and journeys that my characters take around the ship are completely possible because I was able to plot them on these deck plans. You'll see this staircase here, this down staircase, was one of the very few ways of getting from third class to first class and vice versa. It was actually an unmarked staircase. It was a stewards and waiters staircase that only stewards and waiters were supposed to use. But of course, in my book, Jimmy and Omar use this as a way of sneaking from the third class up to the first class areas. And then towards the back of the ship, called the stern, we've got the third class entrance. This is where third class passengers boarded the ship, and these down staircases go down to third class cabins on levels E, F and G. So there we are. The deck plans were a very important primary source. Another primary source, which I mentioned earlier, is photographs. There was a photographer called Father Francis Brown on the Titanic. Here he is with his trusty camera. And Father Brown actually only had 2 days on the Titanic. He got aboard at Southampton and he left the ship at Queenstown. So he had quite a short time on board and of course wasn't there at the time of the sinking. But during the time he was on board, he was taking lots and lots of photos, dozens of photos. And we're very lucky that those photos survived, and they give us a good idea of what life was like on board. Now, I'll show you some of his photos. You can Google his name if you want to see others. This one is the trunks being loaded on at Southampton. Here we have mail bags being loaded up. People gathering on the boat deck. There were lots of children on board, we know. This one is playing with a spinning top. Aha! Who's that on the left there? Shout it out if you know. Yes, it's the captain of the ship, Captain Edward John Smith. And on the right there's a woman selling Irish lace. Some business-minded passengers did set up little stalls on board to sell their wares. This is a promenade, one of the walkways along the side of the ship. And you can see some of the famous deck chairs on the left there. One of the last sightings of Captain Smith as the Titanic was sinking was when he was standing on the promenade deck, throwing deck chairs into the water for people to grab onto. Here we have the reading and writing room. I'm sure all of you would have spent plenty of time in there. And the radio room. There were 2 radio operators, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips. This is the grand staircase, beautiful staircase going down 5 decks of the ship. And the gym. Thomas Macaulay was the steward looking after the gym. That's him in the foreground there on the rowing machine. And behind the pillar, this is mentioned in my book, if you've read it, you'll know this well, the electric camel. The first electric camel in the world You sit on it, you switch it on, and it rocks back and forward, simulating the motion of a camel. Very popular with the first-class ladies and gentlemen in the gym. This is the last photo ever taken of the Titanic, when Francis Brown was being rowed ashore at Queenstown in Ireland. And in hindsight, he must have been very relieved that he came ashore. In my book, Survivor Titanic, there are some real characters. Of course, Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, who designed the boat. Jacques Futrelle is mentioned. He was an American author who wrote a book called The Thinking Machine. He wrote it before Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, but The Thinking Machine is very similar in some ways to Sherlock Holmes. A very clever and observant genius who is able to solve people's mysteries for them. John Jacob Astor was the richest man in the world. He was a businessman, an inventor, an author of science fiction. And he had just got married, actually, a few months before taking the trip on the Titanic. His wife, Madeline, was put into a lifeboat. Of course, there was a rule of women and children first. And John Jacob Astor did some heroic things as the Titanic sank. He wasn't able to get a lifeboat. Instead, he went down into third class and he helped people to find the exits. There's also a story that he went into the dog kennels where there were 6 dogs in cages, and with his revolver he blew the locks off the cages so that the dogs wouldn't drown in the cages. And lastly, this is Jack Thayer. He was 17 years old at the time of the sinking, travelling with his father in first class. And here is some of his account, a really amazing story of his escape. It was now about 2:15 a.m. As we knew, the last lifeboat had gone. We could see the water creeping up the deck as the ship was going down by the head at a pretty fast rate. The water was right up to the bridge. There must have been over 60 feet of it on top of the bow. As the water gained headway along the deck, we moved away from it. We were a mass of hopeless, dazed humanity, attempting to keep our final breath until the last possible moment. As I recall it, the lights were still on, even then. So many thoughts passed quickly through my mind. I thought of all the good times I had had, and of all the future pleasures I would never enjoy, of my father and mother, of my sisters and brother. I sat on the rail, facing out, and with a push of my arms and hands, I jumped into the water as far out from the ship as I could. When I jumped, I was only 12 or 15 feet above the water. The cold was terrific. The shock of the water took the breath out of my lungs. Down and down I went, spinning in all directions, swimming as hard as I could in the direction which I thought to be away from the ship. I finally came up with my lungs bursting. The second funnel suddenly broke off, emitting a cloud of sparks. It looked as if it would fall on top of me. It missed me by only 20 or 30 feet. The suction of it drew me down again, struggling and swimming. As I finally came to the surface, my hand came against something smooth and firm with rounded shape. I looked up and realized it was one of the collapsible lifeboats, which was floating in the water bottom side up. About 4 or 5 men were clinging to her. I pulled myself up as far as I could, almost exhausted, but could not get my legs up. I asked them to give me a hand up, which they did. Well, as we've seen, Jack Thayer had an absolutely miraculous escape from the ship. He was one of the last people on the ship before it went down. He jumped into the water, and that funnel that smashed down into the water next to him and missed him actually created a wave which turned over one of the lifeboats that had already left the ship. Terrible for those people in the lifeboat, but lucky for Jack because he was able to swim out to it and scramble up onto the top of the upturned hull and spent the night there along with, I think, 17 other people awaiting rescue. Now, if you've read my book, Survivor Titanic, you will see some similarities maybe between Jack Thayer's escape story and Jimmy's attempt to escape as well. Now, it's time for you to do some work. You're going to be imagining your own character set on the Titanic. So forget Jimmy and Omar and Beryl and all of the characters in my book. You're going to be thinking of your own survivor for an exciting adventure story. Now, all I ask is that your character should be not less than 5 years old and not more than 100. So that gives you a wide range of possible ages to deal with. And I'm going to just start asking you questions about your character's age and who they're traveling with and what class they're in and all sorts of different things to help you to build up a picture in your mind and on paper of who your character is. So grab a piece of paper, grab a pencil or whatever you normally write with, and this is just rough planning, so it doesn't have to be neat. It's going to be a list of bullet points, kind of a fact file about your character. Now we'll start with some easy questions and we will then go a little bit deeper, a little bit more complicated. First of all, is your character male or female? Just write down one of those two things, male or female. And then write down your character's age. How old are they? More than 5, please. Now write down what class your character is travelling in. First, second, or third. Next, your character's nationality. And use your knowledge of the Titanic. You'll know that there were lots of English passengers, lots and lots of Americans, lots of Irish, some Italians, some French, quite a few Lebanese characters, and some from other nations as well. You choose. Okay, next, give your character a name. Give your character a name. And make the name kind of fit the nationality, yeah? So if your character is Lebanese, don't call him Bob. Next one. Who is your character travelling with? Who's he or she travelling with? Could be a family member, or a friend, or maybe someone they've just met. It could be a pet, I suppose. So long as there's someone or something for your character to talk to. Next question for you. Why is your character travelling to America? And again, use your historical knowledge. You know that lots and lots of passengers, particularly in third class, were travelling to go and live in America. They were wanting to make a new life for themselves. A lot were Americans travelling home. A lot went just as tourists or to experience the first voyage, the maiden voyage of the amazing Titanic. So you choose, why is your character going to America? And when you've done that, I want you to think a little bit about your character's personality. Imagine what your character's best friend would say about them. What kind of a person are they? So I'm not so interested in the physical description as I am in your character's character. What are they like? What makes them tick? Are they confident or shy? Are they optimistic or pessimistic? Are they witty? Are they a bit slow? You choose. What sort of a person is this? And maybe write down 4 or 5 interesting adjectives to describe your character's personality. Okay, when you've done that, I want to know your character's favourite place on board the ship. What's their favourite place to hang out? Again, use your knowledge of the ship. Is it the cabin? Is it the gym? common rooms or reception rooms, the dog kennels maybe, the swimming pool, the ice cream kitchen. You choose. What's your character's favourite place on board the ship? And if you have finished all that, then just while everybody else is catching up, could you add maybe one or two more things about your character? Anything at all. Anything at all. Okay, you should have in front of you a list of facts about a character in your imagination. And it's funny, isn't it, the way that they start to kind of take shape in your mind, and they start to become almost like a real person in your mind. You kind of get to know them almost like you would get to know a new friend. Maybe you've already got an idea of how they talk, you know, how their voice sounds and the sorts of things that they say. Character really is the most important part of any story. And plot kind of flows from character. Sometimes people get so obsessed with the story itself and things that are going to happen one after the other, and they don't spend quite so much time on coming up with a really interesting, believable, three-dimensional character. So that's why we're giving lots of time to this before we leap into the story itself. Now, when you do leap into the story, there are different ways of starting and different styles of writing. I want to show you something here. This is not the beginning of Survivor Titanic. In fact, it's not a particularly good way of opening a story. Have a listen and think to yourself, what's wrong with this? What don't you like about this as a way of starting the story? In April 1912, there was a boy called Jimmy who was travelling on the Titanic with his mother and his older brother Ralph. They were going to America to start a new life there. Jimmy's father had gone ahead of them to find work. Jimmy was a mischievous boy who loved playing tricks on his older brother. He was also extremely adventurous. Every night, Jimmy would sneak out of the cabin and roam throughout the ship, seeking excitement and adventure. Now, you may be saying to yourself, actually, that wasn't so bad. It's introduced the setting, it's introduced the character Jimmy and his mum and his brother, and we've got to know a little bit what Jimmy's like. But it was probably a tiny bit boring, or more than a tiny bit. It's kind of just a list of facts about Jimmy. Jimmy was mischievous, Jimmy was adventurous. And the problem with that is that it's telling, not showing. There's another way of doing it, and that is to show rather than tell. So you plunge your reader straight into the middle of a scene, and you show Jimmy being mischievous. You show him being adventurous. This is the first chapter of the book. You may have read it already, but just listen to it and see how different it is to that earlier example that we had. Chapter 1. Hey Ralph, can we swap bunks tonight? Why? My older brother sounded suspicious. You're going to be kicking my bed springs, Jimmy, is that it? Of course not, Ralph, I said, trying to sound all innocent. I just want to try the bottom bunk. Fine, but no monkeying around, do you hear me? Mam switched out the lights and lay down in her bed next to our bunk bed. Sweet dreams, boys, she said. Only 3 sleeps till we reach New York. 3 sleeps until we see your pa again and start our new life in America. The massive engines of the Titanic thumped and growled beneath us, and the steady heaving of the ship rocked us to sleep. At least, it rocked Mam and Ralph. Me, I pinched myself to stay awake. My plans for the night did not include falling asleep. As soon as it was safe, I slid out of bed and arranged a fake Jimmy under the blankets. I rolled up clothes for the body and used Ralph's football for the head. Then I crept across the cabin and slipped out, closing the cabin door as quietly as I could. very different, isn't it? Because in a way we're right there in Jimmy's head, or at least perched on his shoulder. You know, we're experiencing things with Jimmy, and we're seeing his character revealed not through some omniscient narrator, but through the events and the action of the story itself. Now, this is something that I'd like us to experiment a little bit with, and I'm going to ask my daughter Libby for her help in doing that. Okay, Libby, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. You've done an activity. You've created your own character who's going to be having an adventure on the Titanic.
Yeah.
So we're just going to go through the main categories and just tell us really loudly what you've done for each one. Firstly, is your character male or female?
Female.
Female. I should say I don't know what Libby's answers are going to be. Okay, this is as much a surprise for me as it is for you. So we've got a female. How old is she?
11.
11-year-old girl. What class is she travelling in?
She's in 3rd class.
In 3rd class. What's her nationality?
She's British.
Okay. And her name?
Abby.
Abby. Abby's 11-year-old. She's travelling in 3rd class. She's British. Who is Abby travelling with?
Her big brother.
Her big brother. Do you know how old he is?
He is 21.
21. That's a big age gap. Okay. Why are Abby and her brother travelling to America?
Because her brother is the only person who has to look after her, so he needs to make money, so he's going to start a band in America.
Oh wow! So he's a musician. What does he play?
Plays rock.
Rock music. Okay. What's his instrument? His main instrument?
Drums.
Drums. Okay. Has he got a drum kit on board with him?
No.
He's going to find one when he gets there.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Tell me a little bit about Abby's personality. 4 or 5 interesting adjectives to describe her.
She's quite clumsy, but she's adventurous and brave. And she's quite sensitive and shy, though.
Okay, very good. And her favourite place on board the Titanic? Where does she like to hang out?
She likes to go where all the pets are kept.
Ah, the kennels.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good. Does she have a pet on board?
No.
No. So she likes to sneak in there and hang out with the pets.
Yeah.
Interesting. And did you think of one or two other things maybe about Abby?
Yeah, she has really red hair, and she's got a plaster on her right thumb, which I think could come in handy in the story.
Well, you've already got an idea of how this is going to turn out. Okay, interesting. So really red hair and a plaster on her right thumb. Libby, thank you ever so much for doing that. Okay.
Okay, I've opened up a new document on the computer. I'm going to start writing a story featuring Libby's character, Abby. So let's just remind ourselves of who Abby is. She's 11 years old, isn't she? And she's British. She's travelling in, was it 3rd class? 3rd class. She's got a big brother who is going to start a band in America. He's a drummer, isn't he? Let's put that he wants to make his fortune in America as a drummer. Let's give him a name as well. Think of an old-fashioned name, maybe Walter. Walter, there you are. Not a kind of granddad sort of name, but it would have been a young person's name back then. And what did Libby say about Abby's personality? She said that she was clumsy. That's quite an interesting trait. And adventurous, brave, sensitive, and shy. Now we're going to try to show those characteristics rather than just telling the reader that Abby is all of those things. Abby's favourite place. Libby said it's the kennel room. And I've done a little bit of research, and that's down on deck F. And a couple more things about Abby. She has masses of bright red hair and a plaster on her thumb. I don't know if the plaster is going to end up being a useful detail at all, but it's actually good if you know a lot more about your character than your reader does. This is deck F, so it's very near the bottom of the ship. and I've managed to locate the dog kennels here. Now, we don't have to do this process, but if we're writing historical fiction, as we said at the beginning, it does help to make your story feel more real if you put in a little bit of research. So let's imagine how Abby is going to get to the kennels. Well, I can't see any staircases in this section. There is one up here. It's just next to number 1 boiler casing. There's a staircase marked up. So let's just see where that goes. This is the deck above it, and there's number 1 boiler casing. Okay, so this is the staircase that we highlighted before, and of course now it says down because it's going down to the floor below. This corridor here is actually quite interesting. It's the longest corridor on the Titanic. It was called Scotland Road, and it runs almost the whole length of the entire ship. You can see the engines here, so it would have been extremely loud going along this part of the corridor. And on the other side are some cabins, I think, for butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, all sorts of cabins and crew canteens here. I don't know how they got a wink of sleep being so close to the engines. Anyway, you can imagine Abby creeping along Scotland Road, maybe late at night, and darting down this staircase here, coming out on deck F, going along the corridor between these boiler casings, and going and hanging out with the dogs. It's good to think about what sort of things she might have heard as she was exploring this part of the ship. She would definitely have heard the engines, because as we've said, they would have been extremely loud. You might have heard some noises from the sea, you know, the waves hitting the side of the ship, and probably the dogs barking as well. As she approached, she would have heard the dogs barking in the kennel area. So all of those sorts of sensory details will help to bring your writing alive. Okay, back to our story, and now we are equipped to be able to imagine this scene. So Abby moved quickly along Scotland Road, keeping her head down, even though it was 11:30 at night. This corridor was still busy with stewards going about their duties and third-class passengers hurrying between their cabins and the common room. 11:30 at night. I don't really like this word busy. I wonder if we could make it something more interesting, maybe a buzz. That's a strange word as well. The corridor thronged. How about that? The corridor still thronged with stewards going about their duties. And should we add an adjective for the stewards as well? Should we call them prim stewards going about their duties, and third-class passengers? Let's say something about Abby. We could say, how about this? Nobody paid any attention to one 11-year-old girl. Now we've kind of smuggled in her age there. It's still showing though. And we can also mention her bright red hair. Even despite the hair, nobody really paid much attention to her. I suggested that we think about the sounds that Abby can hear, because that will really bring the writing to life. So let's start a new paragraph and have a little bit of writing about the sounds that she can hear. Abby past the engine room on the right, maybe on her right, and she can hear the engines. Maybe it makes her wincing at the loud thrum of Titanic's engines. Maybe change loud for something better. Cacophonous. There we are. That's really loud. A really loud din. And I've spelled it wrongly. That's better. Then went through an unmarked door and down a darkened staircase. So this is her going down to F deck, Went is a bit boring, isn't it? Should we change that for something more interesting? The steady beat of the engines gave way to other sounds. What could we say? The slap of the waves against the ship's hull and the muffled barking of dogs. There we are. That's hopefully really, put the reader in Abby's shoes. We're right with her, and even though we don't know a lot about her yet, we are sort of intrigued. Where's she going? What's she going to do? Maybe she could say something to the dogs, even though she's not arrived at the kennels yet. Maybe she wants them to be a bit quieter. Pipe down, friends. Abby whispered, "I'll be with you soon." That shows that she loves animals. She's talking to them as friends. Maybe something else would be better than friends. How about cuties? Pipe down, cuties. I'll be with you soon. Now let's show something else about Abby's character. Even in this early stage, Libby said that she was clumsy, so maybe we could have her fall over. How about this? In her hurry to reach the kennels, Abby slid on a... I don't know, what might you slide on? Banana skin? we don't want it to be too much like a comic. She slid on a patch of newly polished floor. How about that? And fell on her bottom. And maybe she thinks something about how clumsy she is. Clumsy Abby, she thought. Accident Abby. I like Accident Abby because of the alliteration or assonance. Accident Abby, she thought ruefully. That was what her older brother always called her. Should we put his name in as well? Smuggle his name in there. Her older brother Walter. There we are. So this is showing, not telling. We've gone straight into a scene of exploration at 11:30 at night. We have shown the reader that we're on the Titanic, and we've introduced the character. This 11-year-old girl, she's called Abby. She has an older brother. She's clumsy, and she's got bright red hair. So already we're getting to know the character quite well. How about you have a go at writing the opening to your story? Keep the character profile next to you so that you know exactly who your character is, and just imagine them maybe late at night, maybe it's 11:30 at night, 10 minutes before the iceberg strikes, and your character is in their favourite place. If they're with somebody, you could write a little conversation. Make sure you have loads of description of things that they can see and hear. And if you can, and this is for the clever ones, try to show something about your character's personality. Show that they are witty by having them tell a joke, or show that they are pessimistic by having them moaning about something. Okay, I'm going to give you 7 minutes to write your introduction. The iceberg hasn't struck yet. Everything is fine, but you're introducing your character. Off you go. Okay, well done. I wonder how you found that. Some people find it easier than others. When you're confronted with a blank page, some people can just launch straight in and start writing really quickly, and others struggle with that a little bit. My advice would be write until you write. Yeah, just write rubbish if you need to, just to get your hand into the habit of writing something. And then as you write, you'll find that the good ideas do start to flow. Remember, this is a first draft, so it's not going to be perfect. And you need to give yourself permission just to write and get your story down on paper, and then at the end of that, that's when the real fun begins, because then you're rewriting and polishing and making it even better than it already was. Okay, so we've done the first section, introducing the character, and I call this section the all is well section, because your character hasn't really got any big problems yet. But as it's a Titanic story, we do need the iceberg to come in sooner or later, and sooner is better. So let's have the iceberg striking now. And remember where Abby is. She's inside and she's low down in the ship, below the waterline. So she's not going to be able to see the iceberg coming. So think about what her experience is of the iceberg hitting. Well, she would feel the jolt, wouldn't she? She'd feel the jolt, and maybe it knocks her to the floor again. So how about this? As she got to her feet, Abby suddenly fell down again. Except this time, it was not her fault. An almighty, what should we call it, a jolt was shaking the corridor around her, and Abby heard, what did she hear? How would you describe that sound of the iceberg rubbing along the hull of the ship? Deafening, should we go for deafening? Always a useful word, isn't it, for loud noises? A deafening, grating sound, like... we need a good simile here, don't we? What's it like? Like maybe sharp metal? Bars of sharp metal? I'm sure we could come across something better if we had time. Bars of sharp metal being scraped along the side of the hull. Maybe we'll say what side it is as well. Starboard? Would Abby know that? I'm not sure she'd know that. Maybe we'll take that out. If Abby doesn't know it, then the reader shouldn't know it. There we are. Is she scared yet? Well, maybe a tiny bit, but she's not terrified. She just doesn't really know what's going on. An eerie silence followed. Now this would be because the engines had been switched off, and actually that was what alerted most passengers to the fact that something was wrong. Was not the jolt itself, but the silence of the engines having been switched off. So we could say something about that maybe. It took a while for Abby to realise what was so strange about that silence. Those engines, what shall we call them? Those great thudding engines. Southampton, that's not a place. Southampton had been switched off. And she's not terrified, she's just a bit uneasy. Let's call it a slight uneasiness. Uneasiness? Unease? That's a better word. Crawled across her skin. For the first time that evening, she wished she was, or were, I think were is probably correct, safely back in the cabin, back in her cabin. The cabin is okay. With Walt, sleeping soundly and dreaming of her new life in New York. Okay, so this section that we've just written is the problem rearing its ugly head. All is no longer well. We can see that the character is starting to be put in danger. But when you're introducing danger into a story, I think that almost always it's better to introduce it slowly. And then the reader gets that kind of creeping sense of unease or suspense. Not terror yet, but just that kind of delicious feeling that actually all is not well. So have a go at that yourself. Think about how your character experiences the iceberg hitting. It may be, if they're outside on the deck, it may be that they see the iceberg coming, or hear the bell up in the crow's nest, or hear a shouted warning. But if they're inside, maybe the first thing that they notice is the jolt itself. If they're in the restaurant, maybe a glass falls off the table, or a bread roll rolls along the floor. You know, something real that happens that will indicate that all is not well. Have a go. 7 minutes. Happy writing.
I wonder how you got on with writing those two parts of your story. I really hope that you enjoyed it. That's the main thing. And if you were to continue this story to its end, you would want to continue working on that emotional arc that Abby is experiencing, where it starts with all being well, and then goes to a kind of slight unease, and then maybe a little bit of fear, and then terror, and then panic, which would be the climax of the story, and then some sort of resolution, hopefully managing to escape and survive. As you plot the story, there's a little phrase that I often find useful, and that's this: chase your character up a tree and then throw stones at him. Now, it's not talking about real trees or real stones, it's a metaphor. It's basically saying put your character in a difficult situation and then make it even more difficult. So as Abby goes from unease to fear to terror to panic, you're basically piling more problems onto her, more difficulties, more obstacles to overcome. So maybe as she is going to find her brother, she gets trapped by a set of watertight doors. So she gets in the lift, and the lift starts to fill up with water, and then she gets lost, or her brother is missing, or he's hurt, or she tries to save the dogs, but the cages are locked. You know, just throw all sorts of problems at your character and see how and whether your character is able to overcome them. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this workshop today. The hour has flown by, but I hope that you've got something useful out of it. And do remember all of those tips about writing. Concentrate on character rather than plot, and then when you do get round to plotting, remember that phrase about chasing your character up a tree and then throwing stones at him. Take care. If you need any reading material, I hear that this book is good. Nice chatting with you, and hope to do this again sometime. Bye bye.